In a quiet, isolated town nestled deep in Nebraska, nothing much ever happened, and the air was thick with secrets everyone pretended not to know. Our house sat right on the edge of a sprawling cornfield, its endless rows stretching out in every direction, fading into the horizon like something out of a dream or maybe a nightmare. One chilly autumn afternoon, I was riding my bike home from school, enjoying the crisp air and the crunch of leaves under my wheels. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the road. Then, without warning, it happened. Lost in my own thoughts, I was pedaling along when my bike chain suddenly snapped. The bike lurched to a halt, nearly sending me flying. I looked down, frustrated, and saw the chain hanging loose from the gears, hopelessly broken. I tried everything I could think of to fix it, but nothing worked. My hands were covered in grease, my fingers aching from fiddling with the metal, but it was no use. The chain was completely shot, and there was no way I could ride home. I looked down the long road stretching out before me inside. Walking all the way home would take over an hour, maybe two. Then, as I wiped my greasy hands on my jeans, I glanced over at the cornfield. The setting sun cast an eerie glow over the rows, making them look darker, almost sinister. But as creepy as it seemed, the field was a shortcut. If I cut straight through it, I'd be home in a fraction of the time. I could practically see my backyard on the other side. Or at least I convinced myself I could. I stood there, hesitating, my parents' warnings echoing in my mind. A few minutes passed, and I started to feel strange, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling that something was out there, hiding among the stalks. The rows stretched on endlessly, identical in every direction, and I began to feel dizzy, disoriented. The path behind me looked the same as the one ahead. I tried to keep my bearings, telling myself it was just a straight shot, but that growing sense of unease gnawed at me, making me question if I'd veered off track. Then I heard a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the corn just out of sight. I stopped, holding my breath, telling myself it was just the wind. But it didn't sound like the wind. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps, slowly and carefully moving closer. My heart began to pound, a cold sweat prickling on my forehead. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep walking, but every few steps the sound would start again, always a little closer. After a while, I picked up the pace, pushing my way through the stalks as fast as I could. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and I found myself struggling to breathe then. Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I saw a figure standing between the rows a few yards away. It was a man, dressed in old, tattered clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in years. His face was half hidden in the shadow of his hat, but I could see his eyes cold, hollow, watching me with a strange intensity. For a moment we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then he lifted his hand, pointing at me with a slow, deliberate motion. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it seemed to echo through the field. "You're lost, aren't you?" he said. His tone was mocking, almost taunting, and it sent a chill down my spine. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, frozen in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. He took a step toward me, his hand still pointing, his face twisted into a strange, unreadable expression. "I can help you find your way," he whispered, his voice low and sinister. "I know this place. I know every row, every path. You'll never leave on your own." That broke the spell. I turned and bolted, dropping my bike and running blindly through the corn, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't care where I was going. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they were going to give out. I tripped and fell, scraping my hands on the rough ground, but I didn't stop. By some miracle, or maybe just raw desperation, I stumbled out of the cornfield and onto the road just as the last light of day faded. I staggered home, sore and shaken, and the sight of our house flooded me with relief. My parents, frantic with worry, met me at the door, but I could barely explain what had happened. All I could say was that I'd gotten lost, that I'd seen something in the field. The next day, my dad went back to search for my bike, but it was gone. Not a trace remained, as if it had simply vanished into thin air. My parents tried to comfort me, insisting I'd just imagined things, but I knew what I'd seen. That man, his face, his voice lingered in my dreams, haunting me for years to come.